The bad guys are stacking stuff up.
What it is he's getting more information. The problem of it is the information he's getting, it could be one thing.
Okay, Maria, I heard you on Hun when they were talking about confirmation bias in my earpiece, so what do you got to say?
It is implicit bias. It's confirmation bias. It's racial socioeconomic bias. The moment they got the call and they know the community is a transitional community, as I heard it described by one of the litigants, it is code word for rundown, poor people, black and brown, people who tend to commit crime. So he went in there with that attitude. When he saw her unkept house, in his opinion, he automatically said, oh my God, there's a burglary going on because this is a poor neighborhood and burglaries happen. They're broke as hell. So let me protect myself so that I don't get killed. Confirmation bias. It's not intentional. I do it sometimes if I'm in a neighborhood, I press down my lock button. But guess what? I'm not a police officer and my decisions do not cost people their lives because I'm not carrying a gun.
Yeah, I'm going to push.
I'm not letting my bias affect my judgment on my job.
Yeah, let me push back on that a little bit and ask you the following question. I mean, I've worked with police officers and their training for many, many years. They are trained to look at certain things that may be out of the ordinary. So when he is seeing, and it may not always be right, a house that's disheveled or in disarray, that is something they're trained may be, not necessarily, but may be evidence of a burglary, and that's what he's describing. So I mean, are we supposed to ask police officers to suspend all common sense and all inferences in the name of not being accused of confirmation bias? I mean, is it not an appropriate thing for an officer to say, I see a disheveled place, which I know from my past experience could be evidence of a burglary? Is that a bias?
It's not a bias, but it depends on the community that you're policing. The community, you have to know. Community policing involves knowledge and understanding of the cultural and ethnic elements of this particular community. So if you're in a community where people's yards could look like Sanford and Son, you need to understand that doesn't mean there's a burglary in progress. You have to know your community and not fear the community that you're policing because it impacts your judgment. You have to not make assumptions, and you have to announce yourself in a situation like that instead of assuming that there's a crime in progress when the girl's house was just messy because it cost her life for that.
Okay, Judge, let me ask you then, if it is a confirmation bias in terms of a racial issue, then I guess the assumption being made is that in those communities, there's more likelihood of a messy house than not. And I would push back on that to say, I believe that people keep their homes neat and clean and all those things, regardless of your racial background and where you live. So is it inappropriate for him to say, it's a factor I have in my head when I'm going there, that I'm seeing something that I've been trained may lead one to the conclusion a burglary is in place, because we would expect otherwise to see a more put together home. I get it. Some people's homes aren't that way, but does that have anything to do with race?
Well, I think we need to be clear when we're talking about there's a difference between profiling and confirmation bias. They could be mixed together, and they certainly can actually work in tandem with each other. Racial bias or implicit bias is saying, look, I'm going to look at a particular community, I'm going to look at a particular people, I'm going to look at folks who look a certain way, and I'm going to form certain opinions and ideas about their criminality, about what activities they may be involved in. Confirmation bias is where we're brought, we have a particular, as law enforcement officers, we have a particular idea about what's going on here, and everything that we see around us, we're looking to confirm that as evidence of what it is we believe in the first place. And as someone who practiced civil rights law and has since 1999, I can tell you that confirmation bias has led to quite a few lawsuits because police disregard other evidence that tends to negate the guilt of a particular defendant and pointing to somebody else because of confirmation bias.
Well, I want to pick up on that, Marie, what the judge just said there, because I have witnessed this firsthand, where people roll up onto a crime scene and say there's a divorce going on or whatever in a murder case, and they automatically point to it's got to be the ex-husband or the soon-to-be ex-husband, and all the evidence that supports that theory is in that tunnel, but anything that's contrary to that theory kind of gets disregarded. These aren't bad people. They're not trying to do a bad thing, but it is a very real reality. And I've got 1 or 2 cases right now as a defense lawyer that I can't shake the prosecutor from the idea that there's evidence that's contradicting your theory, and you need to be bigger. You need to reopen your mind and your perspective to realize that what you may have initially thought, understandably, may not necessarily be the way it is. I say, Marie, this is one of the biggest problems we have in the criminal justice system, is an inability to reevaluate the evidence because everybody becomes locked into my way or the highway. Thoughts?
And I'm not saying, let me be clear, that this officer is a racist and it was racial bias. I'm saying it was implicit bias based on his preconceived notions about the neighborhood. It made him enter the crime scene with an attitude, and that attitude escalated after he saw the house because he made assumptions. And I want to say ASS assumptions, because they were wrong and it wasn't intentional. The bias was not purposeful. Right. It wasn't malicious. It was just something that comes with being a human being, right, and not having the proper training to know the community that you're working in. Because if he knew the community, maybe he would just take the mess to mean that there was a felony being committed. That's where my problem is with him. He assumed something that wasn't there because maybe he didn't understand the nature of the neighborhood he was policing. Community policing means you need to know the community.
Okay, you got it, Marie. You got it. I well articulated, understood. Could you just get to the question, if you don't mind, about whether you think that these investigations sometimes take their own route, regardless of whether it's black, white, rich, not rich, whatever, and then they just seem to disregard any evidence that comes to the contrary, is a major problem in the criminal justice system?
Yes, it is. And this investigation took its own route and it created this major problem, the death of this innocent woman. Yes, it did.
Okay, excellent, guys. Great discussion. Love mixing it up here.